Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Andrea and I have an amazing guest, and we cannot wait to introduce you to Miss Kay Warren.
Kay is one of my favorites. I have followed her for so many years, and she's been such an inspiration of mine throughout my whole journey. So I can't wait for you to hear her. Kay is actually the co-founder of the mega church Saddleback in Orange County, California. After the death of her son, she actually started the Breathe Ministry, which supports parents of children with serious mental illness. Breathe offers weekend retreats, online retreats, and more. So use this resource. It's really, really a great resource.
Yeah, I loved hearing all about that. And I just want to highlight one of the great takeaways from this conversation for me was the fact that Kay is actually articulating a process and a framework for the healing journey for us parents. And
Mm-hmm.
it was just incredibly inspiring. I can't wait for everyone to hear all about that.
Yeah, it was so amazing. And you know what I loved about her was she was so authentic,
Mm.
and she said things that I know at least you and I have experienced, but maybe never really shared. And she was just so genuine, and I just really appreciated her authenticity. So I'm
Yeah.
excited to hear her.
Yeah. This is a special one. Before we started recording this podcast, remember, Andrea, we were talking a little bit about my nervousness to
Yes.
speak to Kay. And I felt so silly and weird about that. It's like we were interviewing Oprah or something. I just was so, I was a little nervous.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to call attention to that because as this podcast opens for everybody out there listening, we're going to go right into this part of the conversation where Andrea, Kay, and I do address the fact that, yeah, I did have a little bit of this nervousness going in before we spoke to someone as truly inspiring as she is.
But I hope you guys all find it as endearing as I did, because it was really, I think, a special moment between you and Kay too. I think she really appreciated your honesty about that. So
Oh,
yeah. So
thanks.
let's go. Let's get into
Yeah,
it.
here she is. It's so okay to be totally honest and very vulnerable in this disclosure. I was telling Andrea earlier that I felt so nervous for our talk today. And I was sitting here, I'm like, I don't know why I feel so nervous. And so we talked about it a little bit. And certainly we're newer in this space and we're trying to become another resource. And you've developed a huge, phenomenal resource for people. So I'm sure there's a little bit of that. But I think just your personal story and what you've gone through with your son puts me in a spot from years ago with my daughter that I quickly realized has always been so scary for me to think about. And I just feel like I'm in your sacred space. And so, that being said, I'm so thankful that you'll even have this chat with us. But yeah, I was just kind of doing a look inward as to why I felt that, for lack of better description, just nervousness to meet you, even.
Well, that I hear you, and I appreciate that sentiment because I have experienced that many times myself.
Okay.
Particularly, I have a friend who lost a daughter in a mass murder.
Oh,
And so
jeez.
when I talk to her or talk with her in a space, I'm always so aware of how tender the ground is,
Mm,
how sacred it is to be in conversation. And
mm-hmm.
so, I have experienced that myself. Our stories are so personal and they are sacred and they are tender, and to walk respectfully and gingerly through trauma and loss and grief, um, it requires courage. It requires
Yeah.
courage on both sides. It requires courage for us to tell our stories. It requires courage to enter into deeply the story of another person with
Oh,
respect and love. And
yeah.
so I receive that from you as not as nerves as much as I receive that as a kindness from you
Oh,
that
thank you.
you honor how tender this ground is.
That was, I mean, so perfectly said when you said that we walk on this tender ground. I mean, my whole body can feel that. That is absolutely what I was saying was nervousness. It is knowing that we're coming into that sacred
Yeah.
place. Yeah.
Well, I
Thank you so
appreciate
much.
that. That's a kindness in me.
Thank you.
I think if we have any other response, that's how we wound each other, actually.
Right.
It's when we carelessly barge into people's stories of trauma and pain and loss that we do damage. We
Mm,
never do damage by saying, I don't want to say anything that's wrong. I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to say something that's inadvertently, makes things harder. That I
Mhm.
can receive that all day long. It's when we just kind of carelessly move into people's stories that damage is done. So your honesty and your vulnerability actually paves the way for great connection.
thank you. It reminds me of actually what we're talking about right now. It reminds me of the movie Avatar. Have you seen
Mm,
Avatar? Where their
forever
main
ago.
line is "I see you."
Mhm.
Mm,
It's almost like in yoga where you say namaste at the end. It's just sort of like the spirit in me honors the spirit in you. I think it's
mm,
kind of along those lines too.
yeah.
But we bring up a point here too is that so often I think one of the reasons why mental
Mental
health
illness.
that's going to be our new
Gotta leave
term.
that in.
Mental health.
Mental illness.
But mental health is not discussed is because people don't want to walk in that sacred ground and they're afraid to talk about it with somebody. So they just
Yeah.
avoid it
Yeah.
instead of coming from it like, hey, I don't understand the shoes that you're in, but gosh, help me understand
Right.
that. And Emmy and I are hoping that, even our little part in this can pave that way. So more and more people are talking about it and our kids are understanding that it's okay and that they can talk about it and share things with one another.
Right. Right.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's why I cheer you on. So I wanted to be a part of this.
Well,
I
we
absolutely
Thank
appreciate
believe
it.
in
you.
that.
Thank
We
you. Thank
we
you.
appreciate it. Now, I would like to start and actually if you can just walk us through your Matt, and do you call him Matthew?
Yes.
Or okay, Matthew's life. What was he like as a little boy and what were some of the things that you saw and just bring us through
Sure.
your journey?
Sure. He was my third, my youngest, and because I already had 2 children, I think I was able to pick up more quickly than if he had been my first or maybe even my second. If he'd been my first, I would have thought, "It's all me,"
Yeah.
and if he'd been my second, I might have thought, "Well, that's the difference between boys and girls." I mean,
Yeah.
but because he was my third, I'd already had a boy and a girl. I knew pretty quickly that he was different than my other children. I just never attributed it to mental illness.
Mm,
I didn't know children could experience mental illness that many years ago. I just didn't know. And I just knew he was different. I knew he was harder. I knew he had more challenges. But I pretty well just chalked it up to his personality being different, not that there was something else going on. So from the time, I mean, his first 9 months were really pretty easy. But then at about 9 months, it's like he shifted and changed completely and would start to like hold his breath. If he got hurt physically or if he got mad, he would hold his breath. He would cry and hold his
mm.
breath until he passed out. And it was like, well, what is that? That's pretty scary.
Wow.
He just had a negative mood all the time. We couldn't play Candyland or Shoots and Ladders or, all the typical little kid games because if he lost, he'd throw the board, cry, be in this like I couldn't distract him. I couldn't like, oh, let's think about this or let's do that. So he had a negative mood, very emotional. I was worried in preschool that, he'd be the first kid ever kicked out of preschool just because he was difficult and a little aggressive. And then by the time he was 7, he started coming home from school saying, "Mommy, I'm so sad. I'm just so
Oh, wow.
sad." And we had moved from the neighborhood that he had lived in up to that point. And so I really thought it was just the sadness that he would feel from moving. He was missing his friends that he was used to playing with. But it became more than that. He lost interest in video games, which is a big deal for somebody who loves video games. He didn't want to play with his toys. He didn't want to play at school. Like, he lost interest in everything, and would just say, "I'm sad," and I'd say, "Did something happen? Did you and your friend at school, did you have a fight? Did you get in trouble at school? You know, is your teacher upset with you?" Trying to just tease out where this sadness might be coming from, and couldn't ever figure it out. I remember asking the children's minister at our church, "Can kids experience depression?" And she said, "Yes, they can." And it was like a light bulb went off in my head. And it was like, then I think he's depressed. I took him to his pediatrician, who agreed that yes, he was clinically depressed. And that just blew me out of the water. Because like I said, I didn't know children could experience mental illness. And from there, it just feels like I feel like every 3 months or so, we get some other diagnosis. Then he started having panic attacks, and, he also had hyperactivity, and so it was like depression, panic attacks, ADHD. By the time it was 11, he'd been given the diagnosis of early onset bipolar, which I don't think they do it quite like that anymore, but at the time, that's
Right.
what they, said. And then suicidality started when he was 12, and then a sleep disorder and body dysmorphic disorder and OCD and major depressive disorder. And then his last diagnosis, about 18 months before he died, was borderline personality disorder. Now, do I think he had all of that? I don't know. I think what it points out is, though, the difficulty in diagnosis
Yeah.
and coming up with exact, clear definitions. What I can end up saying is he just lived a very tortured and tormented life with lot of mental health challenges. And that's one part of him. But the other part of him, the healthy part of him, was sweet and loving and creative and funny and tender, very concerned about vulnerable people, other people. He could always spot the other person in a room who was struggling. He knew how to make a beeline to make that person comfortable, how to engage them, how to relate to them. He was bright. He was he was a beautiful boy, and he was a beautiful young man, and he was complex, multifaceted, and healthy Matthew was an absolute joy to be around. Unhealthy Matthew, as the illness progressed, became sort of a frightening, um, yeah, he could be frightening in some of his responses and some of his disconnection with reality. And he was both. He was an amazing person who suffered a lot.
I love how you say healthy Matthew and then Matthew with the mental illness. Because with both of my kids, I would always try to, I don't carve out the mental illness so that they didn't identify with that, and it's hard to do. And I think as a parent, it's easier to do because we get to see those beautiful sides of them. We get to see the sides that are just lovable, right? And then we also do see the sides that are concerning but it's beautiful to be able to see that you separate it out that way. And I think from at least my own sense, coping when my kids were going through the thick of it was being able to separate the illness from the child.
It was always difficult, I think, in parenting to tease out, like he might behave in a certain way or act a certain way. And we as parents had a lot of conflict trying to tease out, okay, is that his mental illness that's at play here? Is this just he's a human being who messes up? Or
Mhm.
he's got, he just needs to take responsibility for that. It was always so hard to try to tease that out.
Yeah.
And you can't perfectly hardly ever do that. One of the therapists that we saw gave us a visual that helped my husband and I with some of that. She talked about a layer cake, and that when you slice into that layer cake, you're slicing through layers of both cake and frosting. And so you're getting all of it as you slice through.
Mhm.
And so with our kids, sometimes you cannot perfectly figure out what's coming from where. You're getting all of it usually
Yeah.
when you're interacting. But that helped me a little bit to know that I couldn't compartmentalize him too distinctly. I was getting all of
Mhm.
him, and that meant I had to deal with the whole person all the time.
Probably
Yeah.
also helped you, I would assume, it would also helped you, for myself, I should say, not hold on to the guilt when we didn't see that it was that misbehavior was a cause of the mental illness, because sometimes it got so muddy and you'd be like, "Okay, are they just acting out?"
Right.
And so that visual is actually really good because you're just not gonna know sometimes. And
Right.
sometimes it's everything, right? It's all of it.
Yes. Or a giant
Mhm.
plate of spaghetti, it's
Right.
all mixed in
Mhm.
there together.
Yeah.
And you're just getting the whole thing. You can't really pull out the different noodles and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good analogy. Have you always referred to his experiences with mental illness as mental illness? Or because Andrew and I go back and forth on, what is mental illness, or is it mental health struggle or mental challenges? How do you qualify those kinds of terms and definitions?
Yeah, no, it's a great question because the fact is we all have mental health all the way from, yes, we're in a healthy space to, moving into more unhealthy spaces. So again, it's very difficult to be precise with a lot of the mental health diagnoses because it's more art than science, I think.
Yeah.
I hope someday it will be maybe more scientific than it is. But for instance, I used to say emotional imbalance. That was the word Matthew, let's see, he would have been 37. So when he was 30 years ago, there was a lot less known about all of this than there is now. And so we use the term emotional or chemical imbalance or
Mm.
emotional health. And now I think people are pretty comfortable with using either the term mental illness or mental health challenges. I tend to think, and I don't think there's a right or a wrong, I tend to think that might depend on the severity.
Mm.
If someone has schizophrenia, that is definitely a mental illness and a brain illness. If someone has psychosis, that's not just a mental health challenge. There is an illness that's impairing them from living their full life.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you dial that down to somebody whose challenges are not as great and they're able to function pretty well, even within the parameters of having some things that make you want to say, well, that might be a mental illness. I think mental health challenge is probably okay. We do retreats for moms of kids with mental illness, and I had started using the term mental health challenge just to kind of soften it a little bit. And she
Mm-hmm.
was offended. I mean, genuinely offended that we use the word mental health challenge because she felt like we weren't taking her child's illness seriously enough. It's
I mean,
like, this is not just a challenge. No, no, no. And so that's why I don't think there's a right or a wrong. I kind of use them interchangeably. I might use them interchangeably in the same paragraph if I were writing something, because I think as lay people, we don't have to be so absolutely precise. We can kind of accommodate that for some people, mental illness is kind of offensive. They can't use those words. So mental health challenge feels better for them, but also use mental illness for the people whose kid is really, really struggling with a serious problem. And that way they know we get how
yeah,
hard and how difficult it is. So I can go either way on that.
thanks for that. I know Andrew and I talked about this months ago, and it made me question myself and think, oh my gosh, do I have an issue with how I look at my own kids' experiences? But and I think it came into play because each of our kids kind of has some overlap in anxiety and depression. And when she said mental illness, I went, my daughter does not have a mental illness, and it was kind of like that. I went, no. And And I asked my daughter, do you think you have a mental illness? She said, no, I think I have mental health struggle. So we kind of went back and forth on that. And so I appreciate, your perspective on that, because I started thinking maybe it's my problem. Like am I ashamed? And I don't want to say she has a mental illness, but I don't know. It's kind of ongoing dialogue around those words.
I think that you're talking about a very common conversation
Mhm.
Yeah.
that parents have in trying to describe what their child is experiencing, and how, even I think there are cultural differences. There are,
Mm,
in different cultures, mental illness is so taboo that to
Right.
use that term is really inviting pushback or disbelief from other family members. So I think you have to just take into account cultural differences. You have to take just your own family of origin. How was mental health handled in your own family? So that's why I don't think it's a right or wrong. I think it's one of those places we walk kind of softly with each other and figure out what is the best way that feels like in your family to talk about it, and then just not sweat it too much
yeah.
from
Yeah.
there.
That's great. Emmy and I have had this conversation I don't know how many times. We've gone around and around. I wonder if I've referred to it as mental illness because my son got sick, like, overnight.
Yeah.
And
True.
and so then it was like, "Oh, that is absolutely, in my mind, an illness."
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then and now, like, I look with my daughter, and she's kinda gone through some stuff, and now she's got anxiety, and it's like, "Okay, well, now she just has some mental, health challenges," but I think it could be a timing thing too, but severity of it is a big thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Generationally too.
Yes.
Very
Generationally, I
much,
think, is a
very much.
big key.
Good point.
Yeah.
I agree.
So, you mentioned that you do parent retreats. I would be so interested to hear what kind of things you talk about. What do you do? It sounds like a place I could have probably used about 10 years ago of moms, and I don't know, is it just mothers that go?
Currently, well, let me clarify that. We do in-person retreats, which are currently just for moms, but next year hope to expand for couples, so
Mhm.
moms and dads. So the in-person is currently just moms, but we also do online retreats and Zoom calls with mental health professionals. So both of those are open to moms, dads. It could be a grandma, or it could be a
Mhm.
Mhm.
sibling. Because sadly, sometimes it's grandparents who are the main caregiver, or it's a
Right. Right.
sibling who's taking care of another sibling because the rest of the family isn't able. So those are definitely open to other family members. The in-person retreats right now are just moms. I call it breathe, because if you have a child with serious mental illness, it's a long journey. It's a long journey. Some of the moms that I talk with or come to our retreats are moms whose kids are 30, 40,
Wow.
50 years old, and they have been at it for a very long time, and they're weary. They're
Yeah.
Yeah.
just weary. And so breathe is a rest stop on a
Mhm.
very long journey. And so we just work really hard to pamper, to we do everything but chew their food. We just take care of the moms, it's a high touch, high connection, high rest, pouring life back in. And I
Mhm.
follow the same format almost every time, because this is the way that how I learned to deal with my son's serious mental illness and helping other people whose kids have serious mental illness is this. I think that we have to spend some time grieving reality. Because if your child has a serious mental illness and it's been going this way, and it may include homelessness, or it can include substance misuse, or it can include violence, it can include, I mean, at the really far end of the spectrum, there's a lot of grief that you are in this, what often feels like a hopeless cycle.
Mhm.
And and it's rough, it's painful, and to be able to pause and grieve your loss, grieve the loss of what you hoped for your child, and look at the reality, look at
Mhm.
it, look
Mhm.
in the eye and see, this is not what I expected for my child, this is not what I expected for our family. I did
Yeah.
not know any of this was going to be part of our reality, but this is our reality. So it's engaging reality, then being willing to grieve, acknowledge the sadness, acknowledge the losses, and then from there, rebuild hope. So it's engaging reality, embracing grief, and then expanding hope. Because if you don't have hope, you can just get buried in this
Yeah.
long
Yeah.
journey. So uh, that's what we do. It's engaging reality, taking a hard look, and then from there, know that that's going to lead to some tears and some sadness. And we do some grief rituals and grief experiences, and then move people toward hoping again. So they've
Right.
had their rest stop, and then they go out and they get back on the long road that
Mhm.
hasn't changed over that weekend, but suddenly they've got resources and connection. We connect them back with their bodies, connect them with God, connect them with each other, and kind of like fortify them and then push them back out onto that road to keep living with some hope.
No, that's
What a
beautiful.
gift. I actually can't even imagine if somebody would have ever even phrased it as grieving. Like, that actually gets me kind of choked up to think I missed that step,
Mhm.
because if I look back in those years, I think I would have felt like I was taking space
Right.
when there wasn't space to take, because everything had to go to my family.
Yeah.
So to give a woman, a mom, that space seems like a life changing, even a lifeline.
Yeah,
I think
I
that's
agree.
I didn't
extraordinary.
have it either.
That's what I was
And
gonna ask you if you
no,
how
I
you
didn't
learned
have
that.
that. No, I didn't have it. I had wonderful family. I did have supportive friends. It's not like I was completely alone or dealing with Matthew's illness on our own, but there were so many times even with that I felt alone. I felt
Mm,
isolated. I felt like I didn't necessarily fit in other women's groups because while they're, talking about, "Oh, my kid won student of the month." I'm like, "Yeah, my kid punched a hole in the wall last night."
yeah.
um, it can just feel so isolating. And I didn't know where to get help. There weren't podcasts like yours, there weren't resources. And after Matthew died, I just kept thinking, what can I do that is life giving to me now?
Mhm.
In response to this grief and this loss, what can I do that brings beauty from these ashes of his death? And over a few years, it kind of came to me that what I can do is I can help parents.
Yeah.
I can help provide for parents what I didn't have
Yeah.
at a
That's
time when I
amazing.
so desperately could have used
Yeah.
support, could have used connection, could have used the resource to feel like, okay, I can make it. This is
Yeah.
really hard, but I can make it.
I think
And I'm not
sometimes
alone.
the gift is just knowing that somebody else can relate is such a gift.
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
I think that when at least when I was going through kind of the really hard times, I didn't feel like anybody could relate because they may have had different challenges. But I mean, I look back at Emmy, we found out, 10 years after both of our kids kind of were in the midst of their crisis, that had we just talked to one another back then, we would have had a connection of somebody who understood. And think that connection is such a big healing opportunity for all of us. And
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. You to know that there's that's I mean, I'm just picturing in my mind the moment that people drive into the retreat center. They're
Mhm.
in an Uber or they're in a carpool or they're driving in by themselves or whatever. But the moment they get out of their car and see this group of women, knowing that every single woman there knows what she's going through. Because
Yeah.
while the circumstances may be slightly different, there's enough similarity that when they get out of the car, I can't tell you the number of women that break into tears, fall into our arms, weeping.
Oh
I'm
my
thinking of
gosh.
one particular woman the first time she came from Montana, and she was like, "I'm in a rural area. There's nobody out there. There's nobody else who has. I'm totally alone." And she got out of her car and she just grabbed me and she began to weep. And she looked at these other women with their smiling faces and their welcome. And she just said, "My people, these are my
Yeah.
people." And it was like, yes, we are here because we get each other. We don't have to explain. We don't have to qualify. We don't have to put caveats around what we say. It's just like you look at a woman sitting across from her at breakfast and it's like, oh man, yeah, it's like, I see you. I
Yeah.
get you. I know what you're talking about. And that is beautiful. So your podcast has such a powerful connecting that we all just need to be seen.
We
We
do.
need to be
Mhm.
seen. We need to be understood.
Yeah,
You
We need
know,
to
there's
be
so much healing
validated that
and
we're not
connection.
crazy because we think this is also hard and painful because it is.
right,
Yeah.
parenting's hard enough, and then you
Yes.
layer this on top of it, it's just adds a complexity. So Emmy and I always talk about how we we tend to focus on mothers because it seems like mothers are the ones that take the lead in most of this. But we also had a conversation about how our other kids or our partner, husband, might have perceived and handled it himself. And it's so different. I've had some realizations just in the last few months that my husband was coming from a very loving, different place where I thought he was my adversary at the time. I'd like to get your insight from the many people you've talked to as to what do you think the family dynamic is, or what was your family dynamic? How did you manage to support one another?
We had more conflict over this than probably almost anything
Yeah.
in our years of marriage because we're very different personalities to begin with. We already had challenges raising our children just because we are so very different.
Mhm.
I would look at a situation through one lens and thinking he was looking at the same way, and then have these moments of like, oh, you're not looking at it at all the same way
Yeah.
I am. And so just for us, with our strong personalities that are very different, we already had some challenges. And then as you say, you layer in the any mental health challenges, and it just exacerbated some of the conflict. And particularly as it just kept going,
Mhm.
just kept going and going, and for Matthew getting worse and worse, and so then we would doubt ourselves, and we'd start to doubt each other, and it's like, well, if you hadn't done this, I thought we should have done that, or the other person would say, well, I know you're really resistant to trying this, and this, so maybe we should, and so honestly, it was very challenging, and our other kids, because he was our youngest, his older siblings, the good part was they were very attached to him and loved him and were close to him, but also
Sure.
Mm,
extremely
yeah.
frustrated as they became adults and he became an adult, and them seeing the toll that it was taking on us. So first, if there had just been mine and my husband's opinions of what to do, now I've got my older kids who have opinions of what
Right.
we should
Yeah.
do or
And
shouldn't
they're
do.
older. That's right.
That's what I
He's
mean,
a
they are
baby.
older, so
Yeah.
they're bringing their adult perspective
Mhm.
to it, and so there just was a lot of conflict, and I find that when I talk to families, particularly those for whom the illness carries on and
Mhm.
doesn't necessarily improve, um, or very episodic, and those episodes can be, like the bottom falling out over and over again.
Right.
And something that I've learned even since, with my older children, since Matthew passed away, as we have unpacked slowly, not only the trauma of his death, but also the trauma of growing up with a sibling who had serious mental illness, for whom we often centered the whole family around his needs.
Mhm.
And it got again to the place of, is he coming at Christmas or is he not coming at Christmas? Is he going to come mad at everybody? Is he going to come where he loves everybody? So there was always the tension
Mhm.
of, how is he going to respond, or how is this going to be? Or we have a family vacation planned, and oh my goodness, he's not coming at the last minute, and everything's thrown into chaos. So there's so much chaos. There can be. It's
Mhm.
not in every family, but there can be a lot of chaos and a lot of conflict, resentment, um, lack of even understanding on the part of siblings and sometimes spouses, sometimes partners, of what is really going on here.
Yeah.
He or she is manipulating you. You're enabling him or her. Those are such common conversations in families that have heard it all, have lived through most of it, and can verify that families need so much support, so much help. with figuring out even within the marriage dynamic. And then how do you manage a family where there's someone who so obviously has needs that are
Mhm.
great? I don't think there's a good answer. I don't think there's a one size fits all answer as much as just to say, hey, listen, this can get really messy and your family is not weird or bad or wrong if your family's experiencing some of this drama, chaos, conflict. It's so common. And you're not a bad family if your family is walking through some of that. All it points out is that we just need so much support
Yeah.
and so much compassion from other people and places and opportunities to dialogue with each other and glean from other families what was helpful in your family. Ah, maybe we'll try that in our family. Or,
Mhm.
but again, just not walking the path alone.
Yeah. What was particularly helpful for your family in the healing process?
Well, in the aftermath of Matthew's death, we've all done a lot of
Mhm.
grief therapy, a lot of trauma therapy, recognizing that we not only did we look at his life differently and what we should do or shouldn't do, we all grieve differently. Every person grieves themselves in their own way. And so we as mom, I've tried to be very careful not to superimpose on my children that they grieve the way I grieve, that they respond the way I respond. And I've had to absorb some of their anger, some of their sense of, as it feels now safe for them to be able to say, I knew you were there, mom, but I knew your body was in the same room with me, but there were a lot of times I didn't feel you were present because you were present until you got a text from Matthew or until you got a call from Matthew. And then suddenly I would lose you over and over and over again. Your body was in the room, but your
Mhm.
mind and your attention was elsewhere. And I just got so tired of always feeling like my needs were not as important as his. That's hard to hear,
Yeah.
as a mom, that's
Absolutely.
hard to hear because I did not want that from my children. I wanted to give equal attention and love and care to know that I hadn't, and I wasn't always aware of it, and to absorb that without being defensive, and then to have to, like I said, absorb that within myself and not feel guilty because
Mhm.
often I feel like I would still make the same choices that I did because the level of his needs were that high. But I wish I had understood it a little bit more in that time. I wish I had been able to um, find ways to let my other kids know how much I loved them. But now I have the opportunity to say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I was not able to be there in some of the ways that you needed. I I love you with all my heart, and I'll do the best I can from here to um, make up for that in the best ways I can. It's like I said, looking at reality is going to lead to grief, and from grief, you have the opportunity to make repairs, to start again, to acknowledge that you wish it had been different, but don't know that it could have been. So, how can we go forward from here and repair and rebuild? It's hard work. It's really hard work.
That's amazing. I think as a mother in any context, let alone the trauma that your family has been through, to be able to say to your child, I acknowledge and validate your experience. And I'm also doing the best that I can in the moment. And I love you and I hear you. I mean, that's just perfect. It's all you can ever give is to
It is.
say, I honor your experience of this situation, whether I did anything intentionally, I can't control it. And it's just so
Yeah.
beautiful that you give that to your kids. I love that. That's just not many of us can do that in those very vulnerable times in life. So it's beautiful.
It for me, it has come down to I can either be defensive, which is my natural inclination is to defend myself and defend
Yeah.
my decisions and my choices and my actions, um, as to or to just put it back on them, or you were too sensitive, or you didn't understand what I was needing to do. And I mean, I can go at it that way, but what will end up is it will create um, just another layer of separation between me and my kids.
Mm.
And if I want to be close to them and I want to kind of repair what I know is damaged, I have to be willing to sit there and listen. I have to absorb their pain in some way and take it into myself and reflect back to them actually compassion. And it's just not easy. I've done a lot of internal work to be able to get to those places where I don't get reactive, but I can listen and hear and see my surviving children and what they need and what I can best give.
Go ahead.
Earlier, you had
Sorry.
mentioned the guilt. I think I have done a great job of taking on and acknowledging what had to be done, and that there's consequences to those choices that I had to make. But I still hold on to the guilt that I didn't give that child what they needed at the time because I didn't have the bandwidth. And honestly, I thought up until right now I had given that guilt away, but then you're talking about it and tears are coming down my face. I'm like, so it's just
Yeah.
that guilt that we hold on to as mothers, and I'm sure
Yeah.
fathers do too. But we we've got to give ourselves that same love that we give to the kids and to our spouses when we realize that life was not perfect. It was chaotic,
Yeah.
and we were all doing what we could to survive at the time.
Yeah.
It's
Hopefully, hopefully that guilt recedes. That's what I'm hoping for because I still live with some of that. I can weep very easily when my kids say something. So if my first response is to be defensive, my second response is to feel overwhelmed with sadness,
mm,
of what I did or didn't do or could or couldn't do for my other kids, or even things I wish I'd done differently with Matthew. And and I it's natural to feel that way. It's normal to be that way, to have those responses. However, I'm looking to, as you say, forgive myself
mhm,
as well and be gracious with myself, knowing how dinking hard I tried to
yeah,
do it all right and well and good and loving, and knowing that I did not succeed at that all the time. But just be kind to the worried, anxious, struggling mom that I was, who was just really doing the best that she knew how to do.
Yeah. What would you say, Kate? This is what I know what I'm thinking, but I feel like I should say it in a little bit more sophisticated way, and I can't think of anything, so I'm just saying. What if there are parents listening that are in that space where they're so afraid and they're afraid for their child's safety, what what advice could you give or resource, or what should somebody
Mhm.
do? I
Yeah, well, if you're talking about are you specifically asking about suicidal thoughts,
Yeah. Yeah,
suicidality?
suicidal thoughts.
Yeah, Dr. Stacy Friedenthal has written just in the last few months a great book, and I always get the title wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's Loving Someone with Suicidal Thought. That's
Oh,
close to it. Stacy Friedenthal.
mhm.
Um, and it is the book that I wish I'd had when Matthew was younger, because like I said, his suicidality started when he was about 12. And I was just completely freaked out by that, terrified the first time I heard him talk about wanting to die. I just thought, I cannot do this. I simply cannot do this. I am not equipped. And this is not something a mother should ever hear her child say. I remember that. But Dr. Friedenthal's book is practical. It is not written for professionals. It's written for lay people. So it's in very easy to understand practical language. She talks about what to say, what not to say, how to empathize when you need to reach out and get help. It is probably the best book I have read on someone you love has suicidal thoughts and talks about children as well as adults. I think it's also important to not panic because I think that's probably our first response to many
Mhm.
things like that is just panic, like
Yeah.
mine was. And just because a child says that doesn't mean that they're going to attempt to take their lives, but it does mean that we have to engage them at a different level. And we have to engage them in a way that hears what they're trying to say, that figures out what is causing the pain.
Mhm.
And I remember that being that several therapists and several psychiatrists told me as one of the main tasks as his parent was to try to minimize the pain and maximize the pleasure. Because when the pain of living or circumstances gets high enough, whatever that could be, for that, it's going to be different things for different people. But if that pain gets high enough, especially teenagers and children don't have the cognitive ability to necessarily think long term or to think
Yeah.
this is going to pass
Mhm.
or I can get through this. They tend to just think in this moment. And in this moment, I can't get through this. And therefore, the alternative is I don't have any alternative but to get out of the pain.
Yeah.
And so, with children and teenagers in particular, there is an impulsivity that is not always as present as we get older, but to therefore not brush it off. Don't brush off that kind of talk as meaningless or they're just being dramatic. Take it seriously and
Mhm.
try to lean in. I mean, that's a time to lean in to your kids and make sure that you're hearing what is going on. What is causing distress? Is it they're not doing great in school? Is
Mhm.
it they're being bullied? Is there a friend group issue? Is social media influencing them? That is such a danger point, particularly for girls. All the studies
Oh,
point to
absolutely.
how devastating social media can be, particularly for young teenage girls. So, if you're talking about children and youth, really leaning into trying to get to that communicate that you take it seriously, that you're going to be there for them, that you're going to figure it out together, and then really press in and don't ignore that. For adults and people past their teen years, those things still apply, but the reasons can be even more profound. It could be around your
Mhm.
job. It could be around disappointment in life, not feeling your life didn't turn out the way you thought it was. I mean, there's so
Yeah.
many things as well as mental health challenges that can lead to suicidality. So don't panic. Get press in the best ways that you can with compassion and get to find out what's causing the distress, getting people the help that they need, and definitely not ignoring. Do not
Yeah.
play the ignoring and this will go away game
That's
because we're
huge.
talking about somebody's life. You
Right.
Yeah.
have to take it seriously.
Yeah. It's one of those times where we do have to ask the hard questions,
And not be
even at
afraid.
the be
Exactly. And
curious.
not be afraid to use the word suicide or you're
Right.
thinking of taking your life or
Yeah.
you, and that's terrifying for most parents.
Terrifying.
So when my daughter was younger, she was probably 10, she had said that she wanted to die. And I remember the therapist was talking to her and she says, "Okay, let's talk about that. Are you having a feeling that's so bad that you feel like you would be better off if you were dead? Or do you want to die? Do you want to do something to take action?" And I always tried to use that with her when, because she was a child, and I was trying to understand, okay, where are we on this spectrum? Are we over here where we really got to take some action, or are we here where we just need to work, like you said, address the pain? What is the
Yeah.
pain? But when you were talking about this, one of the things that crossed my mind was you had said that he started to have suicidal ideation around 12. He had mental health challenges,
Yeah.
illnesses since he was 7.
Yeah.
How did you feel as a mom when he wanted to leave home and be an adult on his own?
Um, Scared because it was an ever present topic of conversation. sometimes when people die by suicide, people will say, I had no clue. Sometimes they'll say, I had no idea. I had no idea he or she was feeling that way. Had no idea that this came completely out of the blue. And then you can sometimes go back and untangle and find some clues but initially it's like, I just didn't know. With Matthew, it was the exact opposite. It was just a constant topic of conversation for years. And then he would make attempts and attempts to attempt. And so
Oh
even though I
gosh.
didn't expect him to die on the day that he did, it was not like out of the blue for us. And so he was living on his own when he died, and he had roommates, and I was really grateful for that. But when he didn't have a roommate, then I felt he was more vulnerable. He just didn't have the same kind of connection, and there wasn't anybody there to kind of keep me informed of what his mood was doing, how he was feeling. So I did feel he was more vulnerable to be on his own. But he
Mhm.
was also an adult, and I couldn't make him, live with us, and he couldn't live in a mental hospital every day I mean, yes,
Yeah.
sometimes that is necessary, but, um, he would have periods where he would do a little better, and we'd start to think, "Oh, maybe it's gonna be okay." Maybe it's gonna be okay.
Mhm.
But he really just got worse and worse, and there was a lot of just waiting, sleepless nights of and not being able to control it, not being able to do anything really, other than just make him some muffins and go leave him on his porch because sometimes he wouldn't answer the door. I just did everything I could to stay
Mhm.
connected, stay in touch, and knew that he was very, 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 very. I'm not sure I'm
Yeah.
even answering the question that you're asking.
No, I think you are. I think what you're saying is really there is not anything other than fear, really. That was kind of this
Yeah.
underlying, there was always, I mean, we always worry about our kids, but we've added another
Well,
level
for
of that.
me, with my faith, I have my faith kept me going when he was really ill. My faith is what has enabled me to survive and
Mhm,
live again after his death. So for my faith did kick in a way during that time period that was so sustaining because I it came to the place for me of knowing that I had done all I knew how to do, that
mhm,
I couldn't control it all. And I had to get to the place where I could face the reality that I could lose him
mhm,
and 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 say at the same time, and if I do, I know I've done the best I knew how to do, and God will get me through it,
mhm,
and I will not be destroyed. I may be devastated, but I'm not going to let anything that happens to me destroy me. And that was something I had to decide and come to that place. And it actually helped me in those moments when I felt the most frantic, in those middle of the night moments where I was
sure.
awake and fearful and imagining a very painful future, was to come back to my faith and say, okay, I don't know how, but I believe, God, you will get me through if my worst nightmare comes through. You will not leave me. You'll not leave my family, and we will get through this. And that sometimes was what kicked me over into the ability. Okay, I can do this another day. I can
Mhm.
do this another day. I know God is with me. I know I'm not alone. I know God is with me.
No, it's beautiful.
Yeah. That's
It
everything.
really
All you
is.
could do is all you could do.
Yeah.
You had mentioned
Yeah.
that Matthew had roommates. Was he able to kindle friendships and become close to people and have those meaningful relationships?
Yeah, I'd say there were periods he intensely craved, connection.
He did.
He just didn't always know how best to achieve it, but he craved, friendship and deep connection and love and all those things. And he was very blessed to have some groups of people, particularly in his last 10 years, who, man, when I still see them or talk to them or connect with them or text them or run into them, it's like I always say thank you
Mm,
to those people who stayed with him, who just stayed with him. And even when it was not easy to be his friend, even when it wasn't easy to, you make plans to be with him and at the last minute he would cancel it or he wouldn't show up or, and maybe you've done all this and they didn't walk away.
Yeah.
His friends didn't walk away. And I will always, always, always cherish those people. They know who they are. And I tell them at every turn, thank you for loving Matthew when he didn't know how to love back. Thank you for being a friend who was
Yeah.
really blessed.
That's a beautiful thing. I think, hey, you've given so much. Just your whole way of being is you evoke so much peace, and I'm
Right.
sure. I mean, I know that there's so much healing that had to happen for you to get there, but I'm so thankful for having been able to talk with you because you give so much clarity to what is a horrible storm of emotions and fear that even before talking to you, I couldn't have put it into a patterned way of looking at something. Even as simple as you saying that you talk to women at the retreat by saying, first, we're going to acknowledge your reality, then give you space to grieve, and then look towards hope, probably by way of identifying joy and other things. But that is huge. And it's probably very simple for you to say because you're working with women in that space all the time. But I just want to say that is a huge gift to me because the clarity is so validating and empowering at the same time. Because thinking of so many different things on a personal level, those three things I can anchor into and apply over and over and over. So that was just an unexpected gift out of this. So I just wanted
Thanks,
to
Emmy.
say thank
I'm
you.
glad. I'm glad. We
Huge,
can
huge.
overcomplicate things, so
Yes.
easily.
Well, our
And then
emotions
and then you get
suffocate us.
overwhelmed because it all just
Yeah.
feels too complex. So for me, just to bring it to like simple, I can hold that in my hand. I can hold that in
Yeah.
my hand. I can do those three things. As
Yeah.
hard as they are, I can do those three things. I can't
Yeah.
do 20 things.
I mean,
Very
do you
important.
remember having that conversation about trying to get a therapist on to help us understand the stages that parents go through? And I think
Yeah.
this right here is so simple that you can't have hope until you've grieved what you've
Yeah.
lost and
Yeah.
recognize that, that it's not what everything that you expected. So I hear that and
Yeah.
I'm like, there is an absolute process that you can't have hope if you're still so much in turmoil over what's
Yeah.
going on.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah,
And I say that we all want hope. And so we all want to just pole vault
right.
over grief
Heck yeah.
Right.
to
Yeah.
get to hope. So I
I
don't want to
hope.
feel bad. I don't want to
Yep.
cry. I don't want to feel all those yucky emotions. And you cannot get to hope without going through grief.
And
Yeah.
one of the things I
Yeah.
think as parents, when we're going through those hard times, is we don't have the time or the energy to even focus on that. It's all consuming. So sometimes that grief comes years later.
Well, it points out to me the need, exactly what you said. In the moment, things can be very chaotic, very overwhelming, and you are just trying to get through a day. I am not worried whether he flossed his teeth or
Right.
I just want to make sure he lives today,
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
make whether he makes his bed, we can deal with that another day. I just want to make sure, so you're
Yeah.
really very in the moment and getting through a moment or a day or a period or
Mhm.
whatever. So what it points out is that if you aren't intentional, even with just small little places of caring for yourself, if you don't allow those places where there can be breathing,
Mm.
slow down, breathe, refresh,
Yeah.
we will wear ourselves out on this long journey. So you can't wait until perfect conditions before you start taking those breath pauses for yourself. You have to find, even if it's 5 minutes in a day, to do something that allows you to honor your body, your soul, your spirit. It will keep you fueled for the journey.
We hope you enjoyed this episode featuring Kay Warren. To find additional information about Kay, her Breathe ministry, and upcoming retreats and events, please refer to our show notes. You can listen to This Way Up on various platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and more. And if you haven't already, we would love your support by subscribing to our podcast. So please connect with us also on Facebook and Instagram for more information and updates.